Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the 11th webinar of our knowledge building series on reclaiming Adl and Ihsan in Muslim marriages between ethics and law. Thank you for joining us from across the world. We're very grateful for your engaging presence, which enriches and stimulates our conversations with our scholars and activists. My name is Sarah Marceau, and I'm the coordinator of Musawah's Knowledge Building Working Group, and I will be the housekeeper for today's event. The previous webinars looked at Muslim family relationships from a fiqh, historical, legal, and Quranic perspective. Our last webinar featured the groundbreaking work of Dr. Nur Rufiya, who explored the Quranic ethical trajectory towards social justice. She introduced us to her tafsir methodology, a tafsir that starts from the context and speaks to women's experiences. We hope this webinar and the previous ones open new windows for rethinking our family relations towards more cooperations, more equality, and more mutual care and giving. If you missed them, you can watch all the recordings in Musawah's YouTube channel. Today, we have the honor to have with us two amazing scholar activists, Dr. Mariam Al-Attar and Dr. Fatima Seedat, who will discuss one of the key components of our initiative, ethics. What is the nature of moral values? What do we mean by ethics? How does it intersect with the different genres of the Islamic tradition? So our speakers will explore what are these different approaches to Islamic ethics and how we can build upon them to develop an ethical framework that foregrounds gender justice. And before I hand over to my colleague, Mulki Al-Sharmani, who will be the moderator for today's session, I have a few housekeeping items to share with you. This webinar is also being live streamed via our Facebook page and will be available on our YouTube channel afterwards. Participants who are joining us in Zoom will be able to ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If we don't get to your question during today's webinar, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us via the email that is on the screen right now. Please use this chat function if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, and I will be there to assist you. In the chat box, I will be also sharing resources and any reference material that the speakers refer to. If you are tweeting or posting about the webinar, please don't hesitate to tag us at Musawah on Twitter and at Musawah Movement on Facebook and Instagram. Now, let me introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Mulki Al-Sharmani, a dear colleague, teacher, and friend. Mulki Al-Sharmani is Associate Professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Helsinki. She's an active member of the Knowledge Building Working Group at Musawah, and she's the author of numerous publications on gender issues, family law, and Islamic legal tradition. You can access her full bio in our website. Thank you, and now I'm going to hand over the webinar to you, Mulki.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman rahim. I want to welcome everybody. Thank you for your interest in our webinar. And I just want to frame the webinar theme in the context of a research project before I introduce my two esteemed colleagues, our speaker and our discussant tonight, this afternoon. So, as Sarah said, the title of this webinar is In Search of an Ethical Framework for Gender Justice in Islam. And it's part of our research project that has been going on for a while called Reclaiming Adl and Ihsan in Muslim Marriages Between Ethics and Law. And so ethics, that has been a really key theme and an important lens for us in this research project, which is a collaborative project where different authors and research participants coming together working on this Musawah-led project. And so for those of us who've been working on the Quran, we've been really looking and investigating the ethical worldview of the Quran. Those of us who've been working on usul al-fiqh have been really interested also in the questions of ethics and the nature of ethical reasoning and how is that relevant to rethinking the foundations of Islamic legal theory and lawmaking in the tradition. Those of us who've been working on the prophetic tradition and the hadith, as you noticed, have been investigating also how can that the prophetic tradition and the hadith be a source of new ethics of marriage, egalitarian marriage? Those of us who've been working on the modern family laws have been also been very much engaging with the question of ethics and the mismatch between lived realities of women and men in different Muslim marriages and patriarchal ethics. So all of us, the question of ethics is very important. And today, I'm very happy to welcome another collaborator and a participant in our project, our colleague Mariam Al-Attar. Mariam is also contributing to this project and to the public work that the edited volume that we're working on. And in her paper, she is really engaging deeply with this question of ethics. What is ethics as a field of inquiry? Why do we need an ethical framework to rethink gender justice in Islam? What would be the concepts and the ideas of that? And how is that relevant to the relationship between ethics and law? So Mariam will take us in a journey through these questions, and of course she's dealing with them in more in-depth in her paper. Mariam is a medical physicist who has a passion for Islamic ethics and philosophy, so she crossed over to that field and has a PhD in Islamic ethics from the University of Leeds. She is teaching now, a teaching faculty at the American University in Sharjah, and she works on moral philosophy as Islamic ethics, kalam, usul al-fiqh. And she has numerous publications. I just mentioned one, which is Islamic Ethics, the Divine Command Theory in Arabo-Islamic Thought. Recently also she's been working something on Maqasid al-Sharia as well as ethical questions in the Quran, and it's an Arabic publication, and we're looking forward to reading it as well. And very much we welcome Mariam. We also have our discussant, my colleague, Dr. Fatima Seedat. And Dr. Fatima is a South African scholar based at the University of Cape Town. She's a scholar of Islamic studies, and her work covers the connections and intersections of Islam, sexuality, and law. Her PhD is from McGill University, where she examined the discursive construction of the female legal subject. Fatima's work covers a wide range of things that are interconnected, having to do with Islam, feminism, Muslim masculinity, feminist reading strategies and reform methods, and definitely interested in the question of law and ethics. So she is definitely the right discussant for us to have in this conversation, and I'm sure she will have a lot to contribute and enrich it. And also, we want to note also a new project that Fatima is working on, and which is on gender non-conforming Muslim sexualities. And the beautiful thing about Fatima's work is how she combines her scholarship, particularly many of our colleagues in South Africa, marrying very well in an organic way the scholarship and activism. So I hope we'll hear more about that today. Okay, so now let's start this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. I want to welcome Mariam and Fatima. Thank you very much for being with us. So Mariam, I want to start the conversation by, we want to know a little bit about your intellectual trajectory. So you are a medical physicist, and now that switched over and now is a researcher and a scholar of Islamic ethics and philosophy. Tell us about that trajectory. How did you make that crossover, and why do you think it's important to engage with the question of gender from an ethical perspective?
Thank you very much, Mulki. Thank you for Musawah for having me here. Thank you for the knowledge building team. Actually, I was a medical physicist long ago, Mulki. That was like 20 years ago. Since 2004, I left that field and I dedicated my work towards philosophy and ethics. But it's true that I was first a physicist, and it was during my bachelor degree that I actually engaged with the works of some Arab scientists who contributed to the field of optics, like Ibn al-Haytham in the 11th century, and many others. For my master thesis also in philosophy, I focused on the philosophy and scientific methodology of the 12th century scientist and philosopher Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi. The great contributions to the field of science made me wonder about the scope and about the scope of the intellectual activity in classical Islamic era. And I thought that there must be some equal contributions to other fields of knowledge, including ethics or moral philosophy. Why is that? Maybe because I see that there is a kind of similarity between the scientific methodology and ethical reasoning. In a sense, both scientific methodology and ethical reasoning don't very much depend on the cultural context and tradition, or at least I think that must be the case. Well, meanwhile, I was genuinely baffled by some normative beliefs expressed by many ordinary Muslims that seemed to me very uncritical and unreflective, like, for example, the norms that discriminate against women in society and law, although our Holy Scripture emphasizes justice and equality and requires us to think and reflect. I wondered whether there were no attempts in the history of Arab Islamic thought to provide some rational and objective basis for morality, or at least some conceptual tools for ethical reasoning that would somehow allow us to question the unjust normative positions and practices. So I was lucky back then to be introduced by my late professor, Dr. To some classical sources where approaches related to ethics are discussed. That was the tradition of ilm al-kalam, speculative theology, with its schools of thought, and usul al-fiqh, principles of jurisprudence. It was only then that I actually realized that the widely spread beliefs that many Muslims accept without questioning the source of their authority can actually be challenged by arguments derived from within our intellectual tradition, because our tradition is not monolithic and it is not rigid. Now, the main question that guided me since then and during my PhD was kind of meta-ethical in nature. It was the question about the nature of morality and the ultimate source of moral knowledge in the Arab-Islamic intellectual tradition. For the second part of your question, I think that looking at gender from an ethical perspective is very important, and that, of course, does not undermine different approaches to the study of gender, including theological approach, legal, anthropological, psychological, or scientific. But if we are concerned, I think, with the normative perspective, then the ethical approach is the one that we have to prioritize, while taking knowledge derived from the other approaches into consideration. And I think also that scholars working on gender and women rights have been doing exactly that, whether they say it explicitly or not. They have been using ethical reasoning while engaging with different concepts and values and patriarchal constructions found in classical Islamic law and jurisprudence. Unfortunately, in many Muslim majority countries, as you know, some of the discriminatory rules constructed by medieval Muslim jurists are wrongly considered part and parcel of the Sharia, where, as argued by some contemporary scholars, the Sharia must be properly understood as an ethical paradigm.
Mm. Mariam, this is a very rich intellectual trajectory, and really some of the questions that drove and are driving your work are also very relevant to us. Also, ethics as a window to critique, also the need for the integrated approach between ethics and law, ethical approach and law, and really rich. So let me get more into the nitty-gritty things that we really need to discuss today. So, you know, there's this prevalent argument in the scholarship that there are challenges with ethics within Islamic tradition. You know, some of these challenges, you know, like the piecemeal approach, tension between revelation and reason, you know, the perhaps not so worked out relationship between law and ethics within our Islamic textual tradition. Now, as a specialist, as an expert on Islamic ethics and philosophy, tell us a little bit more about these challenges. How do you see these challenges? And also, how do you think they have affected the question of gender in Islam?
I think that yes, issues pertaining to ethics are found in the works of scholars, those works that are classified under different disciplines or genres developed by Muslim scholars in the classical era, including kalam, fiqh, usul al-fiqh, tasawwuf, and falsafa. But needless to say, as everybody knows, fiqh expanded, as you know, and became the dominant genre in Islam, relegating the other genres to the field of the unthinkable and even forbidden, with some influential fuqaha declaring the engagement in any other discipline than fiqh not only superfluous, but potentially leading to disbelief. That applied to kalam, tasawwuf, and falsafa. Considering that tension between revelation and reason, ethics and law that you mentioned, one should mention that, in fact, none of the fuqaha denied that the Quran promotes the well-being, which is maslaha of the people, which is a rather normative position based on reason. Yet, to what extent is reason allowed to play a role in deciding what maslaha, well-being of the people is, was contested by the fuqaha. For example, the principle of istihsan, or I like to translate it to rational preference, employed by early Hanafi scholars, was rejected by al-Shafi'i and other scholars, of course, on the ground that legislation can only be based on revelation and that fallible human reason should have no role in deriving rules that would organize the Muslim society. In fact, only specific Quranic verses and selected parts of the Sunnah were used in legislation. To that, they added qiyas, reasoning by analogy, which was restricted by different methodologies, including differentiation, for example, between hikmah, which has more moral connotations, and the technical illah. And there was another source of for fiqh, which is al-ijma' or consensus. Ijma' actually has never been agreed upon. It has never been agreed upon its scope and its meaning. The four sources were accepted and claimed by most of the fuqaha to be legitimate for deriving legal and also moral rules. The fiqhi jurisprudential methodology, coupled with an understanding of morality that was derived from the Ash'arite Kalam theological tradition, established fiqh as the most legitimate Islamic tradition by firmly grounding morality and law in revelation. In all the pre-Muslim fiqh scholars and all the legislations of the pre-modern fiqh were now seen as reflecting the best possible approximation of the Sharia, or actually the Sharia itself. principles, values, and concepts that were actually constructed by classical fiqh scholars were generally accepted as part and parcel of the Sharia and became the standard for the right conduct and law. However, and I will now go to what you can see in front of you on the slide. Sorry, I didn't have any slides for what I said before, but the importance of ethics nowadays in modern time and in the recent time has been acknowledged. And that is with the weakening of the classical dominant fiqh worldview that used to govern Islamic communities until, let's say, the 20th century. So we can note that first, from the mid of the 20th century, arguments to consider the Quran an ethical text started to emerge, with the publishing of many books and articles that emphasize different ethical values found in the Quran. Also, classical works and manuscripts in theology, philosophy, and Sufisms that are relevant to ethics were published. The third point is the translation and the engagement with modern Western ethical theories started to appear. In addition to that, there is a growing trend of engagement with different fields of applied ethics, such as bioethics, and the publication of the journal that some of you might be familiar with, the Journal of Islamic Ethics that is published by Brill. Also, books are being written under the rubric of Islamic ethics that include different sections looking into the ethical dimension of each of the already mentioned Islamic disciplines, fiqh, kalam, tasawwuf, and philosophy. This is actually an incredible effort and a relatively new development that indicates that there is a growing awareness of the significance of ethics in the contemporary Arabo-Islamic thought, or Islamic thought, if you wish, since people are actually joining us here from different parts of the world. However, that does not really compensate for the true engagement with ethics as an important field of inquiry, with its own questions, concepts, theories, and problems. The piecemeal approach that Mulki, you mentioned to ethics indeed fails to address ethical issues in a systematic way. For example, meta-ethical questions related to nature of morality and moral language are being dealt with under kalam. Normative ethics, whether deontological or consequentialist, are being dealt with under fiqh and usul al-fiqh. Value ethics are being dealt with under falsafa and Sufi works. And by the way, there are two important books recently published, which I hope that it will be shared with you, one by Zahra Ayyubi and another one by Cyrus, and both are related to the value ethics in the Islamic tradition. Now, indeed, if we are to develop an Islamic understanding of ethics, we need to develop a discipline that would build and be in conversation with the ethical theories and norms found in various genres of Islamic literature. Otherwise, the question of gender and women rights and other questions of social justice will remain under the hegemonic influence of fiqhi discourse that is dominated by a pre-modern Islamic theories and that functions as a source of ethics and law that discriminates against women. So I think that we need to engage with ethics in a way that will allow us to elaborate an ethical framework or theory that could explain the meaning of morality and also provide the foundation of social justice, including gender justice. We should by the way, understand feminism, feminist ethics, not as a branch of applied ethics, which is a trend that I can see, but Islamic feminist ethics can be concerned with any branch of ethics, including meta-ethics, normative ethics, and different fields of applied ethics.
Okay. Mariam, this is very insightful. So you are alerting us to this ethical turn, so to speak, in Islamic studies, the possibilities of ethics despite these challenges, and so you are also emphasizing the need to engage with it on multiple levels. Meta ethics, applied ethics, social ethics, and particularly for us, Islamic feminism, which we will now delve into. So the title of your webinar and your paper is In Search of an Ethical Framework for Gender Justice in Islam. First, the first part about the ethical framework, what concepts do you think and what ideas would you put forward for, if you were to propose this, which is the focus of your paper, this ethical framework to rethink, the nature of morality, and then we'll get to the gender part. So what concepts and ideas do you think you would propose for this ethical framework?
Yes, Mulki. Indeed, I noticed that contemporary Islamic feminists and reformers in general often talk of constructing norms and moral values, and that build upon the Islamic principles and sometimes the universal human rights. For example, different derivatives of the term construct, including constructing, constructed, constructions, and so on, are used more than 150 times in Amina Wadood's work Inside the Gendered Jihad. It is used 125 times in Men in Charge, the book edited by you, Mulki, Ziba, and Jenna. As far as I know, that term, construction, was popularized by the late Indian thinker and reformer Muhammad Iqbal, who wrote The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam in 1930. The key word, reconstruction, in the title has connotations of building and renewing, using a mixture of pre-existing and new materials. In this work, Muhammad Iqbal makes substantial reference not only to Islamic sources, but also to German thinkers, including Kant, Immanuel Kant, and Hegel, and others, and some French thinkers as well as Descartes. Interestingly, actually, I came across constructivism when I was working on a paper related to food ethics in Islam. And I read a chapter written by a Muslim scholar. His name is Ibrahim Musa, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with his work. His chapter was Genetically Modified Food and Muslim Ethics, which I found very interesting. In that chapter, Ibrahim Musa recommends a constructivist approach to ethics. Well, that kind of stayed with me, though I got involved in other projects and for a while forgot about it. But I was reminded of it again while reading a book written by a Lebanese Arab philosopher, Adl and Dr, in 1990s, which is entitled Al-Akhlaq wal-Aql, or Ethics and Reason, a critique of Western philosophy. Dr. Adl and Dr is mainly concerned with ethics and political philosophy. He does not really mention the word constructivism, but it is obvious that this his views are compatible with a version of constructivism, and there are many versions of constructivism, by the way, and compatible with that version of constructivism that is close to John Rawls' interpretation of Immanuel Kant. Now, the constructivist approach to ethics is an important development in ethics, very recent important development. The term constructivism entered the debates in moral theory with John Rawls in 1980s, where he offered an interpretation of the philosopher Immanuel Kant's ethics. And an important aspect of constructivist ethics is the view that moral norms do not exist independently, but are constructed by human deliberation. Human knowledge, as founded in reason and experience, is the ultimate foundation of morality and provides the building blocks for norms, values, and principles. Well, whenever and wherever we exist, we actually inherit values from previous generations. We can radically modify these values, and we do that, but the modification is subject to some rational and objective norms and standards. Now, before I explore center contours of this ethical framework and talk about the conditions that any moral rule needs to justify, I would like to talk a little bit about the nature of morality and how that relates to the understanding of morality from within the Islamic tradition. Now, the nature of morality, al-husn wal-qubh, that are the terms used in classical works, or good and evil, was discussed mainly in theology. Now, 4 different positions can be identified there. First is that human knowledge depends on the state of the agent. And that is a subjective view of morality that implies that there is no moral truth and that good and evil depend on the agent. This position was actually attacked by most of the Muslim theologians and other contemporary philosophers as well. The second position is that morality is grounded in a determinate natural cause they called ma'na, that inheres in things and action. The third is that the value of moral action is actually determined by certain aspects and considerations from of the action itself. The fourth and the most popular is that morality is grounded in divine commands and prohibitions. This view is sometimes called theological voluntarism or divine command theory. Now, all these views, except the first one, are views compatible with some versions of what is now called moral realism, because all the 3 views imply that moral truth is discovered rather than constructed. All moral realists believe in objective, mind-independent facts or properties that human ethical deliberation discovers as they actually are. Well, traditionally, many religious thinkers in the West as well have also been moral realists, but this may no longer be the case today. Contemporary religious ethicists in the West mainly often implicitly, or if not explicitly, endorse a version of anti-realism, as argued by Kevin Jung in his book, Religious Ethics and Constructivism, published in 2018. I don't want to talk about that too long, but to say a little bit more about what is objectivism and what we mean by rationality, and what do those mean in a constructivist approach to ethics. I need to mention that an important feature of constructivism is its commitment to the idea that moral objectivity is possible. Therefore, they reject ethical relativism. Constructivists held that practical judgments, right and wrong, or good and bad, can be true or false without representing mind-independent normative facts about the world. However, this does not contradict the belief that we cannot know what substantive norms and rules we should adopt without first knowing the situation of the people, their psychological, historical, and economic reality, which requires knowledge, of course, derived from different disciplines. But in addition to that kind of knowledge that is derived from sociology and other disciplines, we need some philosophical knowledge, as there are some considerations that are specific to ethics or moral philosophy. These considerations are the rational conditions, formal as opposed to substantial, that distinguish the ethical discourse from any other types of discourse. These rational conditions are the rules of practical reason that any judgment, rule, or principle must satisfy to be considered true. Thus, stripping ethics of any ontological foundations, be it natural or otherwise, stripping ethics from any ontological foundation does not mean stripping it from any objective or rational basis, as argued by Adl Daher. Now, the rational conditions, and I'm coming to the end of this short talk, the rational conditions that any rule or judgment needs to satisfy in order to be considered moral or ethical, as suggested by Dr. Adl Daher, are first, for the rule to be moral, it should entail that acting according to it is absolutely mandatory. This can be reinterpreted as saying, do not treat others or do not accept treating others, except in a way that you want to be treated if you were occupying the same position that the other occupies. It has also been often called the universalizability principle. The second condition is, what is required by moral rule cannot be overruled by considerations that do not belong to the realm or the domain of ethics, like legal considerations or considerations of self-interest. Third, consistency. So a moral rule cannot contradict itself. Let's say we cannot say everyone has to prioritize her own interest and abide by her obligations toward others. Such a rule requires one to prioritize her own interest and not to do so in the same time, so it is contradictory. Number four, the fourth condition that any ethical rule has to satisfy is that it applies to all individuals without exception. And the fifth and the last is that the condition that is a condition actually that can be related to the first one, and it is that any ethical rule has to satisfy that it applies to all individual, I got right, sorry. The fifth is actually that any moral substantial condition, which is more substantial rather than formal, and it is related to the first condition. It states that a moral rule should be for the good of all equally. That is mentioned also in the PowerPoint presentation. That's it.
Yeah, Mariam, this is a lot of food for.
I know it's like kind of
no, but this is a lot of food for thought, you know. So the way I understand it is it's a position between moral realism and moral relativism. And then these 5 criteria. So we would like you now to ground this for us. How do you think these concepts and this framework can inform reform of family laws, broadly speaking?
Well, let's say that I think that all laws, including the family laws, that do not satisfy those necessary conditions of moral judgments should be declared as unethical and immoral laws. Those are simply necessary conditions, not sufficient conditions, but if any law does not satisfy those conditions, then it is not a moral law. However, as I said, these are not sufficient, but only necessary, and therefore should be taken into consideration when you are constructing any moral theory that takes substantial values and concepts into consideration, such as, for example, the Quranic value of rahmah, compassion, ihsan, benevolence, or of course, al-adl, justice. We should understand that man partly creates morality based on our objective understanding of human reality on one side and the requirements of practical reason from the other side. And that, in fact, does not contradict with the understanding that values have a rational and objective foundation that make them not real, but objective and rational. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, Mariam. Yes,
and extent, I don't know.
Yeah, and then let's take this to the lived reality. So, how do you see the relationship? How can this be translated to the lived realities of women and men? Struggling and dealing with different forms of patriarchy and gender inequalities. What insights can we take away how would this speak to the lived realities, particularly, Mariam?
Yes. Actually, norms and values are constructed not only in light of reason and traditional values that are inherited from the past. They are definitely informed with the lived realities and the context of human beings. They are informed by our experience, by women's experiences. Those certainly inform the critique of the present values and norms and the construction of new norms and principles. Lived realities, of course, change over time, and so do norms and values as well. And so should the laws that are usually or have to be informed by the ethical approach.
Okay, Mariam, I'm going to bring in Fatima now at this point. Fatima, welcome. I think there's a lot here that we can engage with. Mariam has been talking about the importance of ethics, the importance, and also a systematic, integrated way of engaging with ethics. This idea, this concept of constructivism. I'm sure we're going to be discussing that a lot. Fatima, how would you reflect on this in light of your work, both as a scholar, as an activist?
Thank you to Moki, and thank you to Musawah. Can I just confirm that my sound is good because we were not able to check it earlier? We're good. Excellent. So thank you again to Musawah for this opportunity, to engage with Dr. Mariam. And I must say, when they approached me, I was baffled. I'm not an ethicist. Then I'm still not an ethicist 2 weeks later. I do something very different. And I said to Mulki, if I was going to do this, all I would want to know is, where's the ethics in the law that we practice? And she said, well, then that's what you have to talk about. Talk about that. So that's what I can and I will talk about. And I think to begin, the idea is first to express the sense of gratitude for the scholarship that Dr. Mariam brings. Because what it does is it gives us language, gives us some language and some sort of vocabulary with which to articulate some of the concerns that we've had, and also to help us articulate what we think has been wrong and the struggles we've been having. And for me, it is what is wrong with the application of Sharia or Islamic laws of marriage and divorce, because this is the area that I work in. It allows us, for me, it allows us to articulate that gap between what we expect when we come to Islamic law and once we get here, what we get, right? The gap between what we expect and what we get. I would call this a spiritual rupture. Some might call it an ethical rupture. I'm sure there are better ways of naming it. But it is when there is a gap between our expectations and our experiences of how we understand the divine and our processes of coming closer to the divine, right? A sort of spiritual dissonance. Now, Etin Anwar has spoken about it as inconsistence and contradiction. And we can talk about it also as dissonance. But what I mean by this specifically is a sense that I know my God is good, but when I'm trying to get divorced, I find that my God wants me to follow a law which does not seem good at all, unless I was my husband, and then it seems very good, right? So articulating this gap is an ethical gap, the way I understand it. If we articulate it as an ethical gap, then it's a helpful way of understanding it because it confirms that our experiences are real. Our experiences of the law are real. That the dissonance is not something we're imagining and something we must just get over, because you just need to know what real Sharia is, and then you're going to figure it out. Or you just have to strengthen your iman, and then you're going to understand why you have to, sit in iddat for 3 months, even though you haven't seen the person in a year, right? That it's not simply a matter of bad interpretation or a matter of the laws just not being modern enough. Because we like to say that the laws are just not modern enough. They're just not connected with our modern ways of doing things. So we acknowledge that the norms that are being applied are historical, that they are designed for a different social, political, and historical context, and their application in the present time does not yield similar experiences of what is good that they might have in another time. But some of us are also in doubt as to how those could have been good in their own time, right? And so much of the argument that we see about a new Islamic ethics for the present time holds this argument that the ethics of the past don't fit the present. So I would like to be a little provocative and ask, were they even ethical in that time? And maybe the fact that I can't understand them to have been ethical at that time is an indication that they might have been. That such is the dissonance, such is the difference between that time, the way we understood justice then and the way we understand it now, that I'm not able to understand that past concept of justice. Perhaps that's the case. But I think it's also a valid question to ask, what is the nature of the ethics at that time? So I, for instance, cannot understand how sexual enslavement might have been good for those who were enslaved. So my conclusion on this score would be that the ethics of the past time, as of the present times, were ethical, i.e. that they were considered good, only by those in power, those who it empowered, and not necessarily by all those who had to live within that ethical sphere. But I mean, this doesn't detract from, the incredible value. And I return to, the sense of gratitude for Mariam for opening up language that articulates our dissonance, not merely as wrong understanding, but also possibly as insufficient attendance to the experience of all individuals. That the ethics of the past might have been ethical in certain contexts for certain individuals in those communities, but not for all the individuals in those communities. And I certainly think your not to experience here is very, very valuable. So what might be the ethical premise of a Muslim feminist approach to Muslim marriage, for example, right? Because that's a concern that I have. And if we move from the idea that feminism rests ultimately on the question of the location of power and privilege, right? As they pertain, and it's power and privilege, but specifically as it relates to those who are differently gendered, right? And it provides redress for this. Then a Muslim feminist ethic might begin, I suggest, by asking, what is right and wrong in the gendered locations of power and privilege in Muslim thought and practice, right? What is right, wrong, good? How is right and wrong presented? How is good and bad presented in the gendered locations of power and privilege in Muslim thought and practice? And I think this is important for this idea of constructivism that you're suggesting. Again, I don't speak as, somebody who has studied any of these concepts for any more than a week or two. But what I find valuable here is this idea of that moral objectivity is possible. And what I want to suggest to that is also, and I think it's encapsulated in this concept, that even moral knowledge is enmeshed with social knowledge. So moral knowledge is socially determined, right? And I think that is valuable in it. I think that's one valuable aspect of it. And then within this is this idea of objectivity. And I want to bring what is valuable, I think, from feminist thought on objectivity, feminist approaches to objectivity. So many people might be familiar with Sandra Harding's work on strong objectivity, which is the idea that knowledge is situated. It is not something that's standing in the air, which we pluck up and come to just acquire, but it is situated. It comes from where we are located in our individual social contexts. So knowledge is not disembodied. It is not abstract, but it is located and determined by who we are. This idea of strong objectivity recognizes that any position we take, anything that we know, is determined by where we are located, by our standpoint in the world, right? It challenges this idea that objectivity is the opposite of partiality. That to be objective is the opposite of being biased. It challenges that idea, right? And it says to be objective is actually to have one way of knowing a thing, and that there are other ways of knowing that same thing. But what you have is one particular way informed by your location. It takes away this idea that there is a God's eye view. Like, how would Allah look at it? It takes away that you could ever know that, right? That you could ever say that this is the interpretation of this ayah. This is what this must be understood as only in this way, because it makes you aware that we are present in all of these interpretations. We are never absent when we do the work of learning, of knowing. We are constantly present in that place. I think that's something of value that can come from feminist approaches to objectivity. And then feminist approaches to rationality, I think, can also be valuable here. And we know that, so the idea of the reasoning person has generally been the reasoning man, right? It has not been the reasoning woman, right? It's the man of reason. And when we talk about Islamic law and usul al-fiqh, also we see this concept of ahliya, legal capacity, right? And legal capacity is built on the idea of the maturing individual from a child to a discerning child to a child that reaches puberty, and then the child is has responsibility, has taklif, right? Has responsibility. And we've got all the discussions about this, and somewhere along the line, people seem to think, and we've seen arguments being made, that women have deficient legal capacity, or naqis ahliya, right? We hear that often. And yet, if we read the classical sources, we also don't see that. But it's a very common, I would argue, very modern idea that women's legal capacity is deficient. And that there's that very popular hadith, women are naqisat aql wa naqisat deen, all of which feeds this idea, right? We get schooled in this idea of our deficiencies. So when we come to rationality, we have to also concede to the ways in which masculinity is encoded in rationality, right? What is rational is coded as what is considered normative male thought, not what you and I think is rational. But I know you're speaking about rationality as the discernment of value through evidence, right? That's how you've spoken about it. But the question for me would be, whose evidence and how do we read this evidence? So for example, is a triple talaq rational? Right? Is a triple talaq, the idea that I can stand here and that a man can stand and say talaq to me 3 times and my marriage can end? Based on the evidence of the man who is pronouncing the talaq, it might well be. This is what the law says, he can do it and he needs to end his marriage, and so he terminates it in this way. It wouldn't look like that at all for the woman who's being divorced. And the scholarly view would be, this is sinful, but it is valid, right? So it is sinful, meaning it is not ethical, but it is valid. So how do we work with these laws that are valid but unethical when we're in a situation where we can't have any kind of adjudication on what is ethical? Ethics of a law can't be adjudicated. Only the fact, only the rules can be adjudicated. And when the rules rest on this kind of, I don't know what to call it, well, I called it an ethical rupture, then we're stuck in a law that is not ethical according to many of us, but it's ethical to many others. So another example, because, you know, we have these, I think, examples help us. A woman says, I've been divorced, my talaq was two and a half months ago, and at the end of 2 months, he came into the bedroom and we slept in the same bed. We did not have any sexual relations, but we slept in the same bed because he climbed into the bed. And the next day, he went to the imam, who came back and said, the nikah has been renewed, right? And that is the reality of what we're experiencing. But I don't know how am I for time, Mulki. I don't want to overstretch my time. I have something I'd like to say about experience and then some questions. What's my time like?
Perhaps, and then Alex can correct me on this, perhaps 2-3 more minutes. Alex, is that would be right? Yeah, 3 minutes, Fatima.
Okay, let me finish. Let me just, I want to talk about, and you know, Sadia is also in the audience, so she can also speak to it later, but speaking about this idea of a, of experience. So Sadia and I have recently been writing about how to move from this tafsir of experience into, you know, what might be following from that. And we're talking about, in a book which will be published hopefully later this year or early next year, it's a book of women's khutbahs, which we're very, very excited about. But we've been writing about, we've begun to speak about a tafsir of possibility. What happens when women are included in the equation of full humanity, right? When women enter into authority and become equal beneficiaries and equally responsible for adl and ihsan, right? It's an approach to text that is based on a posture of openness, expansiveness to ideas of goodness, ihsan, and inclusivity, which we do not yet know. So ideas of goodness which we are not yet aware of, but which could well be good, right? So this is the idea that our ethics move, they change. Ethics is about change, right? It is a context, we're talking about a concept that turns on the idea of expanding. So you have new forms of justice always always be able to expand your net of justice to include more and more people, more and more cases, more and more issues, more and more concerns. So just suggesting a tafsir of possibility which would come directly out of our experiences of injustice, be informed by the margins. And this is, just more broadly, Dr. Mariam, just to show how, some of the ideas that you're suggesting can also feed some of the other work that we're doing. And then I'll just end with a few questions, Mulki. They don't take more than half a page. So some of the questions would be, what are the ethics that in the first place gave rise to an idea of marriage as a contract that both parties may not enter into equally, or not enter into with equal contracting capacity, right? So what is the nature of our marriages? Unless you're in the Hanafi school of law, you cannot, men and women do not enter it with equal legal capacity to enter into marriage, and you do not enter it with equal capacity to exit. So the first thing to ask is, what kind of ethics produce that as marriage? And then to undo all of that. And there's a whole lot of undoing we need to do. And then how does that ethics of marriage connect the idea of marriage to marrying being the equivalent of fulfilling half of your faith? So think of the ethics we built. We've said to build half of your faith is to enter into a contract where you don't have equal capacity to negotiate one of the very sort of fundamental aspects of yourself, which is your sexual self, the deeply intimate aspects of your sexuality. You don't have the capacity to negotiate them with this individual. And yet this is supposed to be half your faith. So we've already created a very, very, I could see Dr. Mariam's face going, oh gosh, this is big. And it is big, it is big, it's huge. I think it's a massive, massive issue that we're sitting in. And so all the language we can get to talk about, all the concepts we can get, and the passion we can get to work at it is really valuable. And so I'll just end with one last big question, which would be that if choice and autonomy are elemental in ethics, because it's about choosing what is good and what is wrong and what is bad, right? It's a choice. If that is elemental in ethics, in remaking an ethics of marriage, we need to clarify both autonomy and choice for gendered individuals or individuals who are gendered differently. How do we ensure an ethics that recognizes equal autonomy and agency across the board for all partners in a marriage, for example? And one little device I want to suggest before I conclude would be that we need to think about ethics in marriage, not necessarily about as we speak about men and women or males and females, but in the traditional concept of marriage, what might be the ethics of being wife, of being caught in the subjectivity of wife, of a wife, which would be very different. I've made an argument elsewhere that it's very different from the subjectivity of a woman, and that they're not the same. So I basically just want to say, let's pay attention to this concept of wife, which is very different from the concept of woman. And then how do we move away from the idea of ownership and possession in marriage? Because the two forms of sexuality that are considered legitimate in Islamic law historically and presently are slavery and marriage, both of which are forms of sexual ownership. So how would we move from that? How do we conceptualize marriage where multiple partners is not an exclusively male prerogative, but is based rather on the understandings of relationship and intimacy? And then finally, how do we produce an ethics that is not committed to sexual binary, but recognizes the myriad ways of being embodied and in being ensouled, if that's a word? How do we reconcile an ungendered soul with a gendered body, and what happens in the space between the two? Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Thank you. I think you did a brilliant job of really, really grounding this in the relation to Islamic family law, brilliant. And I think Fatima raised a lot of issue. One that you can engage with on the level of the concepts, Mariam, like rationality and how it is situated, and we have to unpack it, male rationality, also objectivity from the feminist perspective, and then very concrete, excellent examples on related to Islamic family law. And particularly also, I like, Fatma, how you also rename the problem. So it's not just a matter that we are in a different times and different contexts, but questioning back then and this ethical rupture. So Mariam, what would you like to reflect on? We don't expect you to answer everything, but what would be your reflections? Let's have a conversation, the three of us. I want to give you a space to reflect.
Yes, definitely. I'm not going to answer. I agree with like most of what Fatima have said, but and also she has raised many points that it's difficult to. I don't remember everything that I need to really respond to if I am supposed to respond. But you are right. I'm going to reflect only mainly on two things. The objectivity that she mentioned, and talking about also the work of a Western scholar. What is her name? I forgot. You just mentioned.
Harding, you mean?
Yes,
Sandra Harding. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Sandra Harding, and the issue of rationality, and then also the issue of the power relation, and the idea was that. For example, the marriage contract that did not treat the women as equal human beings, was that ethical back then? And how come? Which kind of brings in the question, is morality relative? So it depends on the culture or time. Do we accept that? And we say that there is no truth in morality and everything is relative? And what is the role of power structure in that? Indeed, let me start from here and say that this is a question that really puzzled many ethicists who dealt with this question, is morality relative? Then who is right? Who has the truth nowadays? Most of the philosophers, of course, they refute individual relativism, which simply means that if I think something is right and you think it is wrong, then it is right from my perspective, it is wrong from your perspective, and that's it. We stop here. Most of the philosophers do refuse this. However, when it comes to cultural relativism, that is when one has to stop and think for a while. Indeed, we have said, I've mentioned in this chapter, that actually moral values and norms are constructed. And the main question that is asked in ethics, one of the main questions that is addressed is moral truth something that we discover? Or is it something that we construct? Most of the religious fuqaha would tell you moral truth is something that you discover, and moral truth is based on the commands and prohibitions that you find in Sharia, kind of meaning like Sharia and fiqh are the same thing according to them. So they would say basically that the moral norms and rules are what we actually discover, and it is us, the fuqaha, those who are more knowledgeable in religious scripture, that we can discover that morality. And but they actually did not discover anything. They constructed their moral rules. They constructed the laws. They constructed the way the marriage contract, for example, should be written, inspired by their own values that prevailed at a certain time, which was very much patriarchal. where women had no say in what was happening, actually. And by the way, even if they had a say, most probably they would have adopted the point of view of the fuqaha, because there is something in psychology that is known as adaptive preference. Adaptive preference means that you adapt and you start preferring the things that the way they actually are. So when I see that I have no way out, and that is how things are going, and that is the marriage that is accepted by my friends, by my family, by everybody around me, then I would kind of adapt myself. And if asked, I would say I prefer whatever I am used to, whatever everybody is doing. And I guess, Fatima, that even like if you think of slavery, you're right. Like if we talk about the past, what is moral? Maybe slavery was moral from the point of view of the owners of the slaves. But can we imagine that being moral and accepted from the point of view of the slaves themselves? Impossible. We can't imagine that now. But and there is, of course, there are evidence in Islamic history, or Thawrat al-Zunj, I think it's called, where actually there was a revolt there, where they rebelled against the authority. And that is not only in Islamic history, but everywhere in the world. And that is most probably one of the reasons why slavery was abolished everywhere. And by the way, we were the last to abolish slavery in the Islamic world. Why? Because we think that it is written in the Quran, so it cannot be abolished. Yeah. So I definitely agree with you on that point, that it's not ethical, even from at that time, even from the perspective of those who were enslaved themselves. Talking about objectivity when we talk about ethics, you mentioned like an interesting point, which I am not sure I agree with you or the one who actually brought up that point, which is that objectivity is what is objective from my own experience. Maybe you kind of related that to the point of view of the slaves in the past, that their objectivity was more about being free, not slaves. So you talked about objectivity of women from her own experience. But I think that when we talk about objectivity, or at least the way I understand something to be objective, is that it is not subjective, that it kind of provides a common language and common concepts that can be shared by everyone who can think and reflect. So I can't say that objectivity stems from my own experience or your own experience. There must be a common language. There must be a common agreement on things. And that's why when I talked about moral realism and compared that to constructivism, I said that I think that you can be an objectivist without being a moral realist. You can be an objectivist without saying that what is morally right or what is true really exists in the world and it should only be discovered. No, you can be objectivist if you think that there are certain rules of practical reason that provide you with conditions for the right and true judgments. And those rules of practical reason most probably were not yet developed during the time when slavery was still accepted. Those rules of practical reasons and the conditions of rationality, the 5 conditions that I took from Adl Daher, those have been introduced only in the modern time. So in the past, that concept, the egalitarianism, that every human being is equal in value and worth, was not present. Most probably, if you asked a slave in that time, like, why do you want to be slave, or you would rather be free? Like almost everyone would say, I would rather be free. But most probably, he would not use the arguments that we are that are used today by the people who are talking about human rights. Rationality, you are right. I'm aware that many feminist discourse, they kind of don't like the concept of rationality because that is kind of linked to males and throughout different cultures, not only in Islamic culture. But I think that this is doesn't need to be the case. And I think that it is wrong for a woman to kind of refused to take the concept of rationality into consideration because simply that was traditionally the domain of the males. No, like logic, reason, science, this is something that we share. And we can't say that because this was mainly the domain of the males in the past, that this is something that should continue to be, and then start trying to come up with the ethics of care that emphasize the main thing that women were perceived to be into, that they are more emotional, that they are more caring, so that the feminist of philosophy of ethics should be more about the main attributes that women were perceived to have in the past. No, like feminists are also rational. Feminists are also objective. So the truth, the moral truth, is something that all women and men should try to find, regardless of anything else. I don't have more time, so I finished the 10 minutes.
No, but we could have a little bit more conversation. Oh yeah, okay, hang on. No, I think we need to move to the Q&A because we have 15 minutes left. So I take that back. Back. Okay, so and let me take you to the Q&A, and then I also have some questions. But first, we want to give the floor, a chance for our audience to engage with both our speakers. So there are few questions, but also comments that I want you to be aware of as well, Mariam. And please, Mariam and also Fatima, both of you do contribute to this. So there was one question on about how do you understand Sharia, but also, and I'm going to link the two questions together, like why would Mariam, are you claiming, are you arguing, and if so, why would you include fiqh as part of Islamic ethics? Do you want to take that quickly?
Yes, like I didn't include fiqh as part of Islamic ethics. I think I only said that now there are different approaches to ethics in Islam. Is the approach that studies the theories and the concepts that are found in theology in Kalam, and there is the approach that focuses more on fiqh, and there is the approach that focuses more on Sufi works. So I definitely didn't say that it is the approach that is in fiqh that is the most important for ethics. I wouldn't say that.
How would you understand Sharia, Mariam? That's one of the questions. How would you define Sharia and how do you understand it?
When it comes to the definition of Sharia, I remember that when reading Khalid Abul Fadl, who defines Sharia as being the literal meaning of the word being the path to water, and that the meaning of the Sharia should be an ethical paradigm before anything else. So I think that I would understand the Sharia as the values, the norms that are emphasized throughout the Quran, and not the legal rules that were constructed by medieval Muslim jurists, and that are unfortunately until now still adopted in most of the Muslim majorities countries. That is something that Fatima actually talked about a lot, and all the activists, the gender activists, they suffer because of those rules that refer patriarchal biases, and they are still adopted by different Muslim countries.
Right. So I'm going to combine a comment and a question. So one was more like I guess a rhetorical question, but also like a comment: whose ethics, whose fiqh? And then the question then is, who determines the ethical values? Do you think perhaps the issue is, and this is a comment from one of our colleagues, do you think perhaps the problem is what underlines this debate is the gendered nature of the religious subject? So if it's whose ethics, whose fiqh, and if the question is who defines the ethical value, would you say then perhaps the problem is in the gendered nature of the religious subject?
Like whose ethics, who defines the ethical value?
Yeah. Yes, who defines the ethical values? Isn't it a matter of whose ethics, whose fiqh?
Unlike fiqh, when it comes to ethics, nobody ever argued that it is the ethicists or the philosophers who define the ethical value. No, that's not the case. When it comes to ethics and ethical values, this is a public discourse. Those who define what is the ethical value are those who are engaged in a public discourse that emphasize justice, that emphasize social justice and gender justice, and that who are able actually to engage with different laws that are unjust. So there is nobody, there is no authority who would define ethics and ethical value, but morality and ethics is something, as I have indicated, that is newly emerging as a discipline in Islamic ethics, as an Islamic discipline, with a growing number of people writing books about the main ethical teachings of the Quran, with a growing number of scholars engaging with the many books translated from the Western philosophy that to focus on ethics, with many books being written in Islamic ethics. So this is kind of a culminative thing. Who defines ethics? Who decides ethics? Well, this is something that is decided by many different people who contribute to the field of Islamic ethics and who hopefully at the end would come up with a certain agreement of what are the most important values, the most important norms that are ethical norms, and will exclude those norms and values that are patriarchal, that are unjust, that are definitely in contradiction with the agreed upon. I think that the 5 conditions for rational judgment is something that all of us can agree upon. So any rule, any norm that contradicts one of those 5 conditions of rational judgments should be declared as immoral and unethical. Who defines? Like, nobody really defines. However, maybe the ethicists, the people who are engaged with the ethical discourse, they can have a say in that to help other people to come up and to participate and to say their view, informed and enlightened by different ideas and contributions in the field of ethics, whether in Islam or in Western thought.
So let me ask another question, and I want to bring Fatima in to weigh in on this, and then perhaps Mariam, the final thing. And it relates to Mariam's concept of, ethical framework of the constructivist, and I want to tie it to some of the questions that were raised. So in our work in Musawah, we are informed by these 4 approaches where we engage with the Islamic textual tradition and as a source of ethical norms, and and in an integrated way, right, and revisit it and read it, whether it's the Quran and the tafsir or usul al-fiqh and modern family laws, and then the constitutional guarantee guarantees and our national laws of equal citizenship, equal worth of all human beings, so the Constitution, and then the national laws, and then the fourth thing, the lived realities. How are the lived realities? A lot of what Fatma was saying, where people who feel like this is just not ethical, this is just not good for me, this doesn't serve my well-being no matter what the law says. These are the four things that we work with, and we think they are in conversation with one another. So if we take it back to what Mariam was saying, Fatima, the way I understand this constructionist is that it's a deliberative process of arriving at these ethical rules. So it's not entirely so, and it's sort of in between. But I think there's a space where we can push a little bit against Mariam on that, or unpack it a little bit. So the question I'm trying to ask Fatima is how, since we say we want this to be grounded in Islamic tradition, and we take that as a source of inspiration, as a source of teaching, one of the sources, where do you see perhaps a challenge with what Mariam is suggesting, or a possibility? Do you see this reasoning, this deliberative process, this constructionist? Is there a bit of a tension with the textual aspect of one of our sources? Just what kind of ideas and thoughts or questions does it leave you with? Bring up for you, Fatima?
I think the constructivist approach, the idea that we can, from amongst ourselves, determine what might be a morality that we collectively agree to, it sounds wonderful. I mean, who wouldn't want that? That we could actually figure this thing out collectively, and that would speak to all our interests and needs. The question you're asking, Mulki, is, does it gel with the textual tradition? What do we do with the textual tradition? And I'll attend to that, but just I want to bear in mind my own concern around it, which would be about how does it actually function in real terms in the present,
yeah.
Right? So in terms of connecting with the textual tradition, depending on how you orientate yourself toward that tradition, you either think that you have to take all of it, or you can be selective with it, right? Mm-hmm. And many of us who have experienced, the harsh end of it, are extremely selective about what we're interested in taking and what we're interested in leaving behind. And people can call that inconsistent, or, they love to call us hypocrites. But what it is that it is not hypocritical or inconsistent to put aside a way of looking at, a way of being treated that is unjust. So we are allowed to put aside unjust traditions and unjust ways of living. The question would be, as we constitute these new norms, as we construct them, as we put them together in our social spaces, they will inevitably be informed by the locations of power in our own contexts. Mm-hmm. And the locations of power in our context at present, when it comes to law, when it comes to ideas of concepts of Sharia, concepts of Islamic law, concepts of marriage, are not even, and they're not equal. Right? We're not in a situation where everybody has even an equal access to knowledge, to the sources, to the history, to the languages in which this happens, right? For us to even begin to talk about a reframing of the concept of marriage in Islam from ownership to partnership, it's going to mean a radical reform for Islamic law. And then for us to even contemplate how marriage could not be how marriage might function differently if it didn't function on a sexual binary, and if it wasn't interested only in marrying people who are male and female identified, if it was open to other people as well, people who identify differently. So I think, Mulki, to answer your question in a nutshell would be to say, I think the way we engage with tradition right now, when I say we, I mean feminist scholarship, the way it engages with tradition right now is that it is selective, and I think we can continue to be selective. I think in terms of how we construct this morality in present times, we would have to be attentive to where the locations of power are in present times, as to who would be constructing, from whose perspective we'd be moving, in whose interests would we be moving. Because as it's set up right now, marriage and the framework of marriage in Islamic law is entirely unequal. It is not a framework for equality.
Thank you. Mariam, 1 minute reflection that you want to leave us with before we conclude. You are muted, Mariam. Mariam, you are muted.
I definitely agree that people who are more, let's say, who has less power in their hands, the people, they are the ones who will have more interest in changing how things are, and they will be the ones who will be expressing the moral view. And just to say one thing, like one of the conditions that I am sure that you agree with me, that are very necessary for any law to pass or any norm to pass the test of normativity or morality, is that it should be applied to everyone equally. And when I say it should be applied to everyone equally, that it should be applied to men and women equally. And but yes, definitely those who are in power, those who have more interest in keeping things as they are, they will resist, and that is normal. And I know, I agree with you that, yeah, who wouldn't like that we construct morality? Yes, we construct morality, but the idea of constructivism actually is important only because it explains what has been, what happened in the past, so that we understand that those fuqaha did not discover morality as it is. That is one thing, and then it tells us and describes what we are actually doing when we are critiquing those old norms and when we are applying our modern concepts of justice and equality in constructing new norms and principles that I hope will have one day influence on different institutions who adopt Islamic law.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so I want to thank both of you. This was really, really rich. I took away a lot, and there are a lot of comments here that we are saving for you so that you can take a look, because I'm sure our speakers were busy. We're busy talking. I tried to comment some of them.
Yes, I couldn't read them all.
So if I were to sort of like very quickly just share with you my takeaways, so I feel like, Mariam, what you're doing, you're telling us we need to do the hard work of theorizing, so in this project, it's not just about applied ethics, it's not just about the do's and don'ts, but okay, what is the nature of morality? What's the sources of that? What's the nature of this practical reasoning, and how does it work? And you are telling us, okay, we don't have to, we don't have to opt for a position where we say it's all the ethical values are out there, the answers are out there, and we just go find them. They are nor a relativist position where we say everything goes, so in between, which is the harder position, but then how do you apply, how do you go about that? And I think with, so, and you said another thing that was very key in what you said, Mariam, is that also to think of Islamic feminist ethics, not just an applied ethics, but as a meta ethics. What would that involve? What kind of work can we do on that level? And then Fatima very brilliantly really connected the dots very much and showed us how is this project is relevant in a direct way to the issue of Islamic family law, and Islamic feminist reform. And one key expressions that, or concept that you used, Fatima, and I think really captures it, is the ethical rupture that you said. That there is an ethical rupture. So when we experience the law, whether as women, in marriages, in difficult relationships, or as people, practitioners who are trying to do something about these laws, we experience this ethical rupture. But also you have reminded us of power, location, the gendered religious subject. So to be aware of these things, and perhaps maybe this is something, Mariam, that we can take this conversation further. What would that mean to do this practical reasoning, keeping in mind these issues that Fatima highlighted, the power issue, the location issue. And then, but both of you pointed to the possibilities. Mariam, definitely the possibilities of ethics, and the ethical turn, why ethics as a growing field is important, and because it is also the problem, the ethical rupture. So we really need to work on that. And then also what you were saying, Fatima, you and I think Sadia work on that together also, the tafsir of possibilities, how we can expand justice and expand that to include different kinds of subjects, right? What does that mean, the possibility? And that's so important, because so that it gets us beyond looking at the Islamic feminist project in a very narrow term, right? So I think this was really brilliant. I have so many questions, but we can take the conversation further. We really thank you both very much for a very rich presentation, intervention, engagement. We thank our audience for their questions and their comments. We're sorry we didn't get through all of them, but we promise you we're sharing them with both our speakers, and we can give you their emails, or they can get in touch, and we'll make sure that this conversation continues. And then I think before we conclude, there's the usual, I think what is it called, that we do, Sarah?
Yeah, I will.
Yes, Sarah, I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Mulki-Jan. And please, Hishama, my colleague, will now launch a quick survey. And while you're responding to these questions, I just want to thank you again. I mean, Mulki, Mariam, and Fatima, this was such a thought-provoking conversation. And really thank you, Mariam, for helping us to better understand a field that really seems very complex at first sight. And yet ethics is playing such an important role in the way we relate to our tradition. And Fatima, I just loved how you brought the concept of the ethical gap, but also this concept of tafsir of possibility, on which you work with Sadia Sheikh. And it made me think of a quote from Maya Angelou, who said, "The needs of a society determine its ethics." So definitely these conversations about the foundation of ethics have no choice but to be constantly renegotiated, constantly brought to the ground, to be informed by those who are in the margins. For our participants, I want to precise that Mariam's paper and all of the authors contributing to the webinars will be featured in Musawah's book that we hope to publish in the next year, inshallah. And thank you very much for your constructive comments and valuable questions. We are compiling all of them and we'll share them with our speakers. And inshallah, if there is a chance, they can also communicate with you. I also want to thank the team that is behind the organization of this webinar, and in particular, Alex and Hishama today. The last webinar of this series will happen, inshallah, in May, and we hope you will be able to join us. Please check our website and follow our social media pages for more information. And if you have any follow-up questions about this webinar or the research initiative, you can email us at sarah@musawah.org. So thank you again, everyone, and assalamu alaikum.